should have never stepped inside the cabin my uncle left me. The silence clung too tightly. The shadows stretched too long, and the whispers never stopped once I heard them for the first time. When I got the letter, I thought it was a mistake. My uncle and I had barely spoken. He was one of those family members everyone described with careful words and avoided mentioning in detail. A hermit? A recluse? A man who had long ago abandoned the city and buried himself in the woods, as though the trees alone could understand him. But the letter was clear. His estate, if you could call it, that was mine. A single cabin, miles away from the nearest town, set deep within the pines. The lawyer's words had been cold, practical, stripped of sentiment. The property is legally yours. Do with it as you wish. At first, I saw an opportunity. I'd been drowning in debt, barely holding my life together. Selling the place seemed like salvation. A cabin in the mountains might even bring in good money. All I had to do was visit, take pictures, and get it listed. That was the plan. The drive took nearly 6 hours. With every mile, the roads narrowed, cracked, and gave way to dirt paths. Civilization disappeared behind me. Even the radio faltered into static, until only silence filled the car. The forest grew taller, denser, as if leaning in, swallowing what little light remained. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. The cabin looked deserted, almost skeletal. Wooden boards sagged, the paint long since stripped by storms and years of neglect. The windows were cloudy, hiding whatever might linger inside. A single chimney rose from the roof, blackened and fractured. I should have turned back, but desperation has a way of making you ignore warnings you don't yet understand. The first warning came from the trail itself. Carved into the trees along the path were strange symbols, rough, uneven markings gouged deep into the bark. Some looked like spirals, others like crude eyes. I stopped and touched one, feeling the sharp groove under my fingertips. The wood felt warmer than it should have, almost like a pulse. The second warning came from the key. The lawyer had given it to me in a plain envelope, old-fashioned iron, heavy in my hand. But when I slid it into the lock, the door clicked open far too easily. The cabin hadn't been touched in years, yet the lock was smooth, oiled, as though it had been waiting done inside. The air carried a faint smell of ash and mildew. Dust lay thick across the shelves and floorboards. Cobwebs laced the corners, but the strangest thing was the furniture. Every chair, every table, every object faced the center of the room as if arranged deliberately, waiting for someone to stand there. I told myself I was imagining it, that the cabin was just old, strange, abandoned. My uncle was eccentric, that's all. But as I set my bag down, I heard it, soft, almost like breath brushing against my ear. My name? Whispered slowly. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the sagging walls, the rotting wood, and the silence. I wanted to leave. I really did. But the problem was I had nowhere else to go. And the cabin, it was already listening. The cabin felt heavier the longer I stayed inside. As if the walls themselves pressed closer, the deeper the shadows stretched. I wandered through the rooms, brushing dust from counters and peeling back curtains that released the stale breath of decades. Every corner seemed too deliberate, too arranged. My uncle had left no photographs, no letters. Nothing personal, just furniture that all seemed to face some invisible point I could never quite stand. I thought I was alone until the knock came, a sharp, deliberate sound against the door that jolted me from my exploration. I froze. Out here, miles from town, no one should have been near. The man on the other side was old. His clothes faded like they'd soaked up years of rain. His face was weathered, his eyes pale and sunken but alert. He said my uncle's name before I even asked who he was. Then he said mine. "You're staying here now," he muttered. not as a question, but as if he already knew the answer. I hesitated before nodding. Just for a while, his jaw tightened. He studied me with an expression I couldn't place, part pity, part warning. Then, he pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket and pressed it into my hand. "You'll need these," he said. "Your uncle did. Everyone does. Don't think you're different." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and started down the path toward the trees, disappearing into the growing dusk without another word. The paper trembled in my hand, old, yellowed, creased from years of folding. At the top, in my uncle's crooked handwriting, was a single word: rules. I sat at the table, in the center of the cabin, and unfolded the list. The handwriting slanted unevenly, but every word had been written with care, as though each stroke had weight. Rules for the cabin: 1. Never step outside after sunset. The forest isn't the same at night. What walks there is not yours to see. 2. If the whispers call your name, do not answer. They lie. They will sound like someone you trust. 3. Between midnight and 3 a.m., do not look out the windows, no matter what you hear, no matter how loud they knock. 4. Keep the cellar door locked at all times. If it is found open, leave the cabin before nightfall and do not return until dawn. 5. Place food on the table before you sleep. It does not matter what kind. Something expects it. 6. If you see yourself in the woods, do not approach, and never, under any circumstances, allow it inside. 7. At dawn, speak aloud the words, "I belong here. I hear you." Failing to do so invites notice. You do not want notice. My stomach tightened as I read the rules again. Each line felt ridiculous, yet deliberate, like the kind of superstition old farmers whisper about storms or curses. But here, in this cabin that already breathed too heavily, the words felt different. They felt necessary. I laughed it off at first, though the sound rang hollow against the bare walls. Maybe my uncle had lost his mind. Maybe the man at the door was part of some local folklore. But then why deliver them with such severity? Why leave before explaining? I crumpled the page slightly in my fist, then smoothed it flat again, unwilling to tear it. Something about the ink, the uneven strokes, it felt alive. Like the words themselves carried weight. The sun dipped lower. Through the window, the tree line cut jagged shadows against the amber sky. I thought of the first rule: never step outside after sunset. My body tensed before I realized I was locking the door without thinking. I walked the cabin slowly, checking each room, half to convince myself nothing was there. The floor creaked beneath my steps. In the back hallway, I found it. A door bolted with a heavy iron latch, the wood darker than the rest of the cabin. The cellar. Rule 4. The latch looked sturdy, but something about the scratches along the doorframe unsettled me. Long grooves, as if clawed at from the inside. I forced myself away, repeating in my head that it was just old wood, just years of wear. Still, I checked the lock twice before leaving the hallway. Back in the main room, I noticed the silence pressing harder than before, broken only by the faint groan of the wind. I pulled a can from my bag beans, the only thing I'd brought besides water, and set it on the table. I thought of Rule 5. Place food on the table before you sleep. My chest tightened as I realized I had followed it without hesitation. Like some instinct whispered I should. When night finally swallowed the cabin, the darkness was complete. No glow from neighboring houses. No headlights. Just blackness that seeped through the windows like ink. I sat in bed, staring at the folded page of rules on the nightstand. My uncle had lived here under these conditions. He had survived by obeying them. And now, apparently, it was my turn. I closed my eyes, but every time I drifted near sleep, I swore I heard it again, soft, like a breath brushing my ear. My name. I did not answer. The first night in the cabin felt endless. I lay in the narrow bed, the mattress sagging beneath my weight. staring up at the ceiling where faint cracks branched like veins. The rules sat folded on the nightstand, the ink etched into my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to ignore them. I told myself it was paranoia, that my uncle had been unstable, that the old man who delivered the paper only wanted to scare me. But as the hours passed, silence pressed closer, broken only by the creaks of the wood shifting in the cold. It wasn't like city silence, filled with a distant hum of life. This was heavier, absolute, the kind of quiet that made every breath sound too loud, too vulnerable. Somewhere near midnight, I woke to a sound, a tapping, faint, deliberate, against the window. At first, I stayed still, holding my breath. It came again, 3 soft knocks, spaced evenly, like knuckles against glass. I knew the third rule. Between midnight and 3 a.m., do not look out the windows. The words echoed in my mind, steady and clear, no matter what you hear. But it's difficult to fight curiosity when you're alone. When fear burns hotter with every unanswered sound, my pulse quickened. I tried to convince myself it was a branch in the wind, or maybe some small animal brushing against the wall. Still, I felt at the pull. Another knock, louder this time. Before I realized what I was doing, I turned my head toward the window. At first, I saw only my reflection in the glass, pale, tired, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. But then it moved. My reflection smiled, slowly, too wide. I sat up, heart slamming against my ribs. The figure in the glass tilted its head, eyes fixed on mine. The smile stretched further, skin around its mouth straining as though it might tear. I blinked, and it was gone. Only the empty night pressed against the window, trees swaying in the distance. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trembling. My throat felt raw though I hadn't screamed. The tapping didn't return, but I swore I could still hear something soft, just beneath the edge of silence. A whisper, my name, drawn out, slow, curling into the room. I bit down hard, refusing to answer. Rule 2, do not respond. Minutes stretched like hours. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes again. Every time I drifted near sleep, I felt that presence at the glass, watching, smiling, waiting. Eventually, a faint gray light began to bleed through the curtains. Dawn. My body sagged with relief. Yet the rules burned sharper in my mind now. At dawn, speak aloud. I belong here. I hear you. It felt absurd, like surrendering to a joke I didn't understand. But something in me remembered the smile in the glass, the voice curling my name, and the warning not to ignore the rituals. My throat was dry, but I forced the words out. I belong here. I hear you. The cabin seemed to exhale, wood groaning faintly, as though some tension had lifted. The whispers thinned, fading into silence once more. I sat there for a long time, the morning light crawling across the floorboards, trying to convince myself it had been a dream, but deep down, I knew better. I had looked when I shouldn't have, and something had looked back. Morning brought no comfort. The light pushed through the dusty curtains, but it felt thin, weak, like it couldn't reach the corners of the cabin where shadows lingered. I tried to shake off the memory of the figure in the glass, telling myself it was exhaustion, a dream, some trick of the moonlight. But the words I'd spoken at dawn still tasted strange on my tongue. I belong here. I hear you. The silence afterward hadn't been normal silence. It had been relief, like something listening outside the walls had finally been satisfied. I moved through the cabin cautiously, half expecting to find broken windows or muddy footprints from the night. Instead, everything sat exactly where I'd left it, except for one thing. The can of beans I'd placed on the table before sleeping was gone, not opened, not half-eaten, gone. I searched the floor, the counters, even the trash, though I hadn't thrown it away. The table was bare, the dust around it undisturbed, as if the food had never been there at all. My chest tightened. I wanted to believe I'd misplaced it, that I'd absent-mindedly carried it elsewhere. But the certainty in my gut told me otherwise. By evening my nerves were raw. Every creak of the boards, every whisper of wind through the trees, set me on edge. I told myself I'd follow every rule exactly this time. I wouldn't slip, I wouldn't test them. But exhaustion does strange things to the mind. That night, after pacing for hours, I lay down without setting anything on the table. I convinced myself it didn't matter. Maybe the missing food was just rodents. Maybe my uncle's rituals were the delusions of a man who'd gone mad in isolation. I drifted into uneasy sleep, only to wake to a sound. A chair sliding against the wooden floor. My eyes snapped open. The cabin was pitch dark, but I knew the sound had come from the main room. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it would give me away. Then came another sound, soft, wet, deliberate, chewing. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something sour. My body froze beneath the thin blanket as the chewing continued, slow and purposeful. A scrape of porcelain on wood followed, though I hadn't left any plates on the table. The rules screamed in my head. Place food on the table before you sleep. Something expects it. I hadn't, and now something else had come to claim what was missing. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe too loudly. The chewing grew closer, as though it circled the table, savoring each bite of nothing. Then came a long pause. Silence stretched, brittle and unbearable. I swore I felt eyes in the darkness, sharp and unblinking, turning toward me. My throat tightened. I wanted to cry out, but the whispers rose again, curling through the room like smoke. My name, repeated over and over, each syllable shaped differently as though spoken by many mouths at once. Do not answer. Do not answer. The floor creaked near the hallway. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, began moving toward my room. I clutched the blanket, every muscle taut, my breath trapped in my chest. The handle of the door rattled once, then stopped. A scraping sound followed, nails or claws dragging down the wood. Then silence again. I lay there, paralyzed, until the faintest gray of dawn finally touched the windows. With trembling lips, I forced the words out. I belong here. I hear you. The air shifted. The pressure lifted. The whispers thinned, retreating like smoke pulled through cracks in the floor. When I finally rose, the main room looked unchanged except for the table. A chair had been pulled out, and on the wood, a wet smear of something dark, thick and foul-smelling, like soil soaked in rot. I knew then that my uncle hadn't been mad. He had been surviving. And if I wanted to survive too, I had to know what he'd been living with. I didn't sleep the following day. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound of chewing at the table, the chair scraping against the floor, the way the whispers had slithered into the room. Something had been here with me. I couldn't ignore the rules anymore. They weren't superstition. They weren't madness. They were survival. But survival from what? That question gnawed at me more than the silence, more than the shadows. If I was going to make it through another night, I needed answers, so I searched. At first I looked through drawers and cabinets, most of them empty or filled with dust-coated dishes. The shelves offered nothing but warped books, swollen from years of moisture. But something about the cabin felt layered, like secrets sat just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It was in the hallway, near the cellar door, that I found the first clue. A loose floorboard. I knelt, pried at it with my nails, until it lifted with a groan. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and string, was a leather journal. My uncle's handwriting crawled across the cover. Keep the rules. I carried it to the table, hands trembling. Dust puffed into the air as I opened the first page. The earliest entries were shaky but coherent. He wrote about arriving at the cabin decades earlier, about how he, too, had inherited it after years of family silence. He described hearing whispers his first night, brushing them off as dreams. But the second night, he'd broken a rule. He hadn't offered food. Something came inside. I never saw it. I only heard it eating, breathing, circling the bed. I wrote the first rule that morning, because I knew then, there are things that expect to be obeyed here. The following pages catalogs nights, much like mine. Whispers at the window, footsteps pacing the hall, the reflection in the glass that wasn't his. Each time he broke a rule, the consequences deepened. He began listing them carefully, refining them through trial and error, almost like a scientist recording observations. The whispers know your voice. They will mimic it back until you answer. Do not. They hunger for recognition. The one that looks like me is the most dangerous. It waits at the edge of the trees. It studies me, waiting for me to falter. Sometimes it speaks, but the words are never right. The cadence is wrong. It is learning. My blood chilled as I read. He had seen the same reflection, the same smile that had stared at me from the window. Later entries grew frantic, his handwriting jagged, sentences breaking off mid. He wrote of losing time, of waking to find the cellar door open when he knew he'd locked it. He described claw marks deeper than the wood could withstand, and of hearing his own voice calling from beneath the floor. But it wasn't just him. Tucked between pages were brittle newspaper clippings, browned with age. Missing hiker last seen near Old Forest Road. The family disappears from the mountain cabin. Local authorities decline to investigate further. The dates spanned decades, even before his time here. Some of the names had been circled in pen, underlined as if they were important. One article mentioned settlers in the 1800s, abandoning their homesteads after strange disturbances in the area. No details, just silence that mirrored my own unease. It wasn't just my uncle. The cabin had a history of swallowing people. I turned to the back of the journal and found a longer entry, almost like a confession. I've come to believe the cabin itself is a door, not built here by choice, but rooted here because of what waits beyond. The rules aren't mine. They were here before me. I only wrote them down. Every offering I give, every word I speak at dawn, is not to ward them off, but to keep them content. They want acknowledgement. They want to be heard. If I falter, if I resist, they will claim me as they've claimed others. His last few pages grew more fragmented, written in frantic strokes. It wears on my face now. It waits at the window when I sleep. Last night, my sister's voice. Tomorrow, it might sound like mine. I don't know how long I can keep this up. I don't know if the rules are enough, but I have no choice. One belong here. I hear you. One belong here. I hear you. I belong. The entry ended abruptly. The ink dragged across the page, as if the pen had been yanked from his hand. A brown stain marked the margin. Not ink, something thicker. My stomach churned as I closed the journal. The weight of it settled in my chest like a stone. My uncle hadn't been eccentric. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been documenting his survival, clinging to sanity by putting words to things no one else could see. And now, the cycle had passed to me. I sat back, staring at the cellar door at the end of the hall. The latch glinted faintly in the dim light. I thought of his words. It wears my face. It waits at the window. A chill crawled up my spine. The rules weren't suggestions. They weren't folklore. They were bargains. Rituals to keep something ancient and hungry at bay. The whispers brushed against the edges of my hearing again. Faint, coaxing, as though pleased by my discovery. As though amused that I was now reading from the same script my uncle had followed until the end. I folded the journal closed with shaking hands. My pulse thundered in my ears. Knowledge hadn't brought comfort. It had only deepened the dread, showing me the shape of the trap I was already inside. I wasn't the first to inherit it, and I wouldn't be the last. The silence after the attack was worse than the chaos. When the whispers finally retreated and the shadows dissolved from the windows, I was left alone in the wreckage of my own fear. The cellar door was splintered from within, deep gouges carved into the wood. The curtains clung damp to the glass, streaked with condensation in the vague outline of a face. I had survived, but only barely. I staggered through the cabin in the dim light, exhaustion pulling at my limbs. Every rule had held, but the rules hadn't saved Meave. They had only delayed the inevitable. My uncle's voice in the journal, once a lifeline, now felt like a chain. And that was when I found the second journal. It wasn't hidden beneath the floorboards this time. It was in the cellar, wedged behind an old crate, as though someone had tried to bury it out of sight. The leather was cracked, darker than the first, and the handwriting was sharper, more frantic. I carried it upstairs, my hands trembling, and began to read. The entries started becoming familiar. Notes about the rules, warnings about mimicry, the same tone of weary survival. But as the pages turned, the words darkened. I thought the offerings were enough. They were not. The voices grew louder, closer. I had to try something new. The first was a hunter who passed by. I let him in, gave him food, warmth. When night came, I didn't warn him. I didn't tell him the rules. The whispers fed. They left me untouched for weeks. My breath caught page after page detailed the same ritual. Travelers, hikers, lost wanderers who came seeking shelter. My uncle had welcomed them, all the while knowing what would happen. He had offered them as sacrifices, distractions to keep the cabin satisfied. They don't want me, not if I give them others. The rules work for me, but only if someone else breaks them. The cabin doesn't care who. It only cares that it is obeyed, that something pays the cost. My stomach turned. The newspaper clippings in the first journal, the missing families, the vanishing hikers. He hadn't been cataloging tragedies. He had been keeping score, and the worst part was yet to come. The final entries spoke of me. I cannot hold them off forever. My time is ending. The cabin wants another keeper, another voice to hear its whispers. My nephew will do. Blood ties make the bond stronger. If he inherits it, the rules will bind to him, and I will be free at last. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't fate. My uncle hadn't been a victim, passing down a cursed inheritance out of misfortune. He had chosen me. He had fed the cabin strangers until he could hand it off to family, tying me to the same fate he had endured. The rules I clung to, the words I whispered in the dark, they weren't instructions. They were shackles. A system designed not to save me, but to keep the cycle alive. I dropped the journal onto the table, the sound echoing too loud in the hollow room. My hands shook as I stared at the broken cellar door. All this time, I thought I was surviving, but I wasn't. I was continuing his work. Every whispered word at dawn, every plate of food left on the table, wasn't defiance. It was an agreement, compliance. I belonged here. I heard them, just as he had. The betrayal was total. I sat for what felt like hours, though time had no meaning in the cabin. The shadows seemed heavier now, as though they knew I understood. The whispers returned in faint murmurs, almost gentle, coaxing me to accept, and for a moment, I almost did. But then I remembered the faces. The people who had vanished into these woods, the ones my uncle had written off as offerings. I couldn't let myself become the same. I couldn't follow the same cycle, bound by lies he had written in shaking hands. The rules were never mine. They were his bargain, his betrayal. And now, I had a choice. The cabin creaked around me, old wood settling like a sigh. My eyes drifted to the fire-blackened stove, to the cracked mirror, to the table where crumbs still lingered from the last offering. If the rules were chains, then breaking them might be the only way to escape. But breaking them also meant inviting whatever was outside to finally step. And the betrayal had cut deeper than any claw mark. My uncle had left me here, not to protect me, but to replace himself. The whispers hadn't lied. The danger hadn't lied. But he had. And now, I had to decide if I would follow the rules that had Damned him or burned them to ash. The betrayal weighed heavier than the night. My uncle's journals lay open on the table, their pages reeking of ink and decay, the words like chains around my mind. Every traveler he had fed, every offering he had orchestrated, I saw it all. The rules were never about safety. They were about survival at the expense of others. I couldn't follow them, not anymore. Not when I understood what they truly demanded. But the alternative terrified me. Break the rules and invite the full wrath of the entity into the cabin. Unbridled. Night fell like a shroud. I moved through the cabin methodically, setting out food as I had for the last few nights, whispering the words at dawn, pulling every bolt and lock tight. The air pressed down, thick with anticipation, like the cabin knew I was planning something. I made my choice as darkness swallowed the last of the daylight. I would break a rule, deliberately, not the small ones, like forgetting a plate or ignoring a whisper. I chose the cellar. The iron latch gleamed faintly in the moonlight. My hands shook as I turned it. I knew what I was doing. I knew the risk. The cellar had never been opened, not by my uncle, not by me. And yet, I opened it. The door creaked on its hinges, slow and deliberate. A stench of damp earth and something older rose from within. The air grew thick, heavy, alive. Whispers began again, soft at first, crawling through the floorboards, curling around the walls. Then louder. Names, familiar voices, laughter twisted into calls for attention. I felt it before I saw it. Movement beneath the door. A hand or something shaped like a hand slipped from the shadows, grasping for the latch. My heart hammered in my chest. Every rule I had learned screamed in my mind. The whispers became screams, echoing through the cabin. My reflection in the cracked mirror seemed to shift, tilting its head, smiling, pressing against the glass with hands that weren't mine. From the window, I glimpsed a silhouette. It was me or something dressed like me's, tearing back with eyes too sharp to knowing. I forced myself to speak the words, steady and deliberate, louder than ever. I belong here. I hear you. It wasn't enough. The cellar door rattled violently. I staggered back, almost toppling the table. The food I had so carefully placed trembled with the vibrations. The entity pressed further, unseen forces clawing, scraping, attempting to pull itself into the cabin. Shadows shifted unnaturally in every corner. I couldn't hide. I couldn't run. I could only watch and wait. And then I realized the entity wasn't just outside or in the cellar. It had learned me. It mimicked me, anticipated me. It whispered my fears before I even spoke them aloud. But I had learned something too. The rules were not iron chains. They were suggestions I could bend if I stayed calm, if I kept my voice steady, if I refused to acknowledge its insistence for control. Minutes stretched, endless and suffocating. Then, slowly, the shaking ceased. The whispers dimmed, receding to faint murmurs at the edges of perception. The reflection in the glass flattened, the doppelganger faded, and the cellar door stopped rattling. The cabin exhaled. I did not relax. I could not. The air still smelled of damp earth and something fouled. My chest ached with exhaustion, every muscle tense. But I had survived, not by following the rules blindly, but by challenging them, by choosing. I surveyed the room. Claw marks marred the walls and floorboards. The chair at the table had been pulled out. Food was gone, replaced by smears in the wood. Evidence of its presence remained, but I was still here, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of control. But I knew it wouldn't end. The entity had been delayed, not defeated. The rules, the whispers, the shadows, they were patient. They waited for mistakes, for hesitation, for acknowledgement. I sat at the table, heart hammering, and whispered to myself, almost a mantra, I belong here. I hear you, but I decided, I choose. The night outside stretched endlessly. The cabin groaned, old wood settling, or perhaps breathing. I could feel its eyes on me, but I had chosen, and for now, that was enough. Dawn arrived as a gray smear across the horizon. I stood at the threshold of the cabin, hands gripping the worn frame of the door, listening. Silence. Not the suffocating, expectant silence of night, but a hollow, uneasy quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had survived the night. I had faced the cellar, stared down the doppelganger, ignored the whispers demanding acknowledgement. For a brief moment, I felt free. I stepped outside. The forest stretched endlessly, black branches clawing at the sky. The air was damp, sweet with rot, yet no other sound came. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. My pulse slowed, each breath steadying in the morning chill. Then I saw it, at the edge of the trees, where shadows lingered longest. A figure moved. It was tall, human-shaped, but wrong, its head tilted in impossible angles. And when it stepped forward, I froze. It wore my face, my clothes, my expression. My voice dotted beckoned, not with hands, but with a whisper that carried across the empty space between us. I belong here. I hear you. I spun back toward the cabin, heart hammering, desperate for distance. The door loomed behind me, silent but alive. I thought I could escape, but the porch boards creaked beneath invisible weight. Whispers rose, faint at first, then crescendoed into a chorus. Names I knew, voices I recognized from my childhood, my uncle, even my own calling, coaxing, insisting. I ran, breaking into the trees, lungs burning, branches whipping against my face. But the forest wasn't empty. Shadows stretched and shifted at the edges of my vision. Every step forward felt like walking backward. Every path led me closer to the cabin I had just fled. And then I heard it clearly. My own voice from somewhere behind me, laughing, pleading, whispering the rules I had spent nights memorizing. Place food on the table. Speak at dawn. Do not answer the whispers. Do not look. The ground shifted beneath my feet. I stumbled. My reflection appeared in a puddle beside the path. It grinned. It moved independently. My limbs moved, but not entirely under my control. Panic clawed at my chest. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the trees. I thought I had run far enough, fast enough. But the cabin appeared again, just ahead, as if the night had folded in on itself. The rules, the whispers, the shadows, they were patient. They waited for hesitation, for recognition, for surrender. And I knew, even as I stumbled toward the steps, that this cycle was unbroken. That I had inherited more than a cabin. I had inherited its hunger, its patience, its endless repetition. I stopped at the threshold and looked back into the forest. The figure with my face remained at the edge of the trees, staring, waiting. I realized then that the cabin never lets go, that survival is temporary, that every choice only leads to the next test. And as the whispers began anew, curling around my name, I understood with cold certainty I had never truly left. I had only joined the loop.